All right. My name is Rich Schmidt. We're here with Chris Serra. It's July 13th, 2023. We're at Ponzi Vineyards in Sherwood, and thank you to the whole team here at Ponzi for letting us use their space today. Chris, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate this. First question, why wine?
Why wine? I suppose I could tell you about why I got into the industry, which was I'm originally from the East Coast, from New Jersey, and I had been living with a college friend of mine for a few years, and we found ourselves unemployed for about a year and just kind of fixing up his house. And we decided to both get a job at a tasting room at a winery in Pennsylvania. Actually, this is in Delaware. And we worked in a tasting room at a winery in Chadds, Pennsylvania for the summer, and pouring wine behind the tasting room bar, emptying spit buckets and everything like that, and just for fun. And I actually had a friend who was a somm in New York City who would bring home really good wines from work, and it sort of opened my eyes to this idea that wine was something that I'd be interested in, and that was bigger than and more complex than just what I'd known my whole life until then. I was probably in my, mid-20s at that point. So yeah, that kind of opened my eyes to it, and then in combination with the job at the winery, I sort of got interested in the production end, and I was around 30 years old, and I was about to turn 30, and I decided to move out to Portland just for a change of life, a different kind of adventure, and no real big reason in particular, but I had been here for a vacation and loved it and decided to move out here. And when I told my boss at the winery, he said, "Oh, you have to look up Al McDonald in Oregon. I know you're interested in environmentalism, and he's founded this program called Live, and you should talk to him when you get out there." So, and he also put me in touch with Mark Chen, who was then in Pennsylvania, and I had not met him in person. I just spoke with him over the phone, and he sort of reiterated the idea of talking to Al and getting interested in Live. So when I moved out here, I ended up getting a job at the Carlton Winemaker Studio for, a few months, also in the tasting room. And that was a great job because I learned so much from so many different people. They had, a cooperative there of, at the time, I think it was something like 10 different winemakers. I learned a lot from all of them. Andrew Rich in particular taught me a lot about production and kind of the marketing of wine too, actually. And so just kind of learned a lot from that job and kind of paid my dues, I think, a little bit. And funny enough, we're here at Ponzi, and Louisa's husband was one of the main partners at the Carlton Winemaker Studio. So the industry's small and has a long memory, I think. And so while I was there, I decided to write some letters to the board of directors of Live and ask them if there was any, if there were any openings, if there was any interest in having someone come in and do some work for them. And it just so happened, and my timing was perfect. They were hiring their first full-time person at the time that I wrote these letters, and they said, "Yeah, come in for an interview." And I went for an interview at Alan Holstein's ranch, and it was outside, and the whole board of directors was there, and Alan's dog was walking around sniffing at me while I'm dressed in a suit, thinking, I'm an East Coaster, gotta dress nice, And they're all kind of just like, yeah, okay. So I think I passed the test, and they hired me. So that was kind of how I started at Live. And, your initial question, why wine? I think wine is I wasn't really raised to appreciate wine. We weren't really a wine drinking family. I grew up in a kind of a Italian household, and we had, big jugs of cheap wine sometimes for Sunday dinner, sangria or something like that, but never any fine wine or anything like that. And it took, kind of my coming of age to learn about it and appreciate everything that goes into it and everything that can come out of it, actually. I'm very much interested in art and music. I studied music in college and philosophy, and I'm very much interested in the poetics of everyday life and the poetics that go into making wine, and what wine can actually do for you when you consume it in terms of transcendence. I've had a couple of pretty transcendent experiences when having some wine.
We'll come back to that and pick it up, but let's talk about life before wine a little bit. You mentioned growing up East Coast. Tell us about heading to college and sort of what you were thinking about for your life at that point as you were choosing college and choosing majors and things like that.
Sure. I was very much interested in environmental science, and in fact, I went to University of Delaware. I grew up, like I said, in New Jersey, and wanted to stay somewhat close to home, and I studied environmental science for 2 years, and after taking, I was very much interested in the environmental part of things, but the science part was a little tricky, so I took, chemistry and calculus, and I did okay, but not great, and I wasn't really, the University of Delaware is sort of like a training ground for DuPont engineers, so they tailor their curriculum, I think, to that type of a student. And so I was like, I'm not going to be an engineer at DuPont. I don't want to be a scientist. I want to be, I'm an environmentalist kind of first, and maybe, in the general sense of the word, a poet, kind of more of an artist type, a sensitive type. And I wanted to do something more creative. And so I switched majors to music. And I remember I was in a rock band at the time, and I didn't know the first thing about classical music. And I went in for my audition and played some song that my band had written, and the guitar teacher kind of looked at me. He's like, "That's the first time anyone's ever done that." And he said, "This is a classical guitar program, and we're going to have to reteach you how to play guitar." So I said, "All right, if you're willing to take a chance." And so they took me in the program, and I studied music. And then it just so happened that at the end of college, I had enough credits to earn a second degree in philosophy, because I was also interested in philosophy as well. And funny enough, the philosophy studies that I undertook probably helped me more in my life than anything else. Music, I'll love music for the rest of my life, but I don't think I ever got to the point where I was good enough to make a career out of being a performer, and I didn't have kind of the attention or dedication to do that. It's a lot of work to be good at anything, but especially something so kind of abstract as music. I consider myself a musician, I think, kind of at the end of the day. But I think that from what I've read from some of the founders of the industry, there were a lot of sort of generalists and musicians and photographers and artists that came to Oregon to start growing grapes, because there's a lot of time in between growing the grapes and drinking the wine, so you got to do something with your time. And yeah, so that was my thought going into college, was I wanted to be an environmentalist. And after college, I kind of, realized, you can't really make that much money as a musician unless you're a musician, So I ended up working at a musical instrument mail order company. So I sold trumpets and violins over the phone and stuff like that. And I cut my teeth on customer service there, which I think has helped me a lot with live, actually, because there's no angrier person than a Southern band director that doesn't have their trumpet in time for marching band season, and you have to kind of figure out what you can do for them in the absence of like the thing that they want. So I think that actually helped me a lot with live, because there is a lot of customer service that goes into this work, because you're asking a lot of people, and it's pretty complex stuff at the end of the day. So yeah, and then when I moved out here, it was kind of I got kind of taken by the industry, and when I did end up talking to Al, he became kind of a mentor to me. And when I was hired, I worked a couple doors down from him at Chemeketa Community College, where he was at the time, and I learned a lot from him. And I think a big thing that I learned from him was to figure it out. You don't have to have the answer to everything at the time that the problem comes out. As to Jason Tosh also told me the same thing. Take ownership of this. This is your baby now. So you have to figure out the answers. There's not always going to be an answer for you from someone, but you have your own kind of agency and way of doing things. And it took me a few months to get my bearings, because I didn't really know too much about sustainable wine when I got this job. They hired me because I actually went back to school after I had my music experience to get a business degree. And so I have an MBA, and that was done over the course of 4 years while I was working at the musical instrument company. And so once I got that degree, I said I have to, do something. I always wanted to be sort of an entrepreneur, do something with my own business. And so that's kind of how I landed where I landed, which is, essentially running my own business. But, I of course have to answer to a board of directors and to the industry. But I sort of have a lot of flexibility in what I decide and how I move things through the industry. So it's kind of a dream job in a lot of ways.
So tell me about meeting with Al originally, and about sort of what Live was at that point, or what the kind of the concept was as they were looking to hire someone like you.
Sure, and it's funny because I remember when I went to that interview, I actually called Live low impact viticulture enology, which is what a lot of people think that it's called. It's actually low input viticulture enology. That's where the acronym comes from. So me being kind of a novice at this stuff, I didn't really even know the name of the organization when I went to the interview, which is kind of funny. So when I first started working with Al, I think that the organization was at a point where they had done as much as they could do without a full-time person, really just focusing on building the organization out and kind of thinking of it through more of a business lens than an environmental lens. And because the organization was founded by growers and founded by university extension scientists, it had more of a science-leaning grower focus than really trying to take that work that had been done up till that point. I was hired in 2007, so I'd come in about 9 or 10 years into the organization's existence, and we had 150 members at the time. Right now we have almost 400, including the winery members. So the program was, 3 times smaller than it was at this point now. So I remember I showed up and the desk had, they gave me a laptop, and the desk had like a pile of certificates, and the certificates were just sitting in a pile. And I had a database, an access database, and they said, all right, here you go. And I remember I said to Al, I looked at the budget, and it was like, we're in the red in the budget. What happens if we run out of money? He said, I guess you're going to have to volunteer then. It's like, oh, okay. That was nice of you to tell me during the interview. So first day of work, show up, and we're going to run out of money in a year. So the first thing I did was I started meeting with people in the industry and introducing myself. And I met with Jim Burnett at Willamette Valley Vineyards, and I walked in to meet him. And really the first thing that I wanted to do was just introduce myself to him. I didn't know kind of like who the big players were. I had to rely on Al for that. Mm-hmm. And the first thing Jim said to me when I sat down, I shook his hand. He said, "How much do you need?" And it caught me off guard because I hadn't intended to ask him for anything at that point. And he gave us a grant, and that grant kept us afloat for the first year or two that I was there. And then, I got things rolling, and I think we increased the dues at some point early on because we weren't charging enough. And it took us a few years of, losing a little bit of money each year, but we ended up breaking even after, I don't know what it was, like 6 or 7 years of running the organization. And we've been, in the black ever since. Some years we invest some of that money back into the organization. We are a nonprofit, so some years it'll look like we actually lost money, but it's just because we're investing it into the next year's budget. So we're doing pretty well now. But the first, kind of couple years that I worked with Al, I worked in what was, they had converted like I call it a broom closet, but it was like Chemeketa was an event center, at least that location of Chemeketa Community College was an event center for like weddings and stuff like that. And it was the room where like the brides would get changed for the wedding. And they're like, well, that's the only room we have. So here you go. So, I started working from home a little bit, and they actually built another building next to it, which is I think it's called the ERATH Center now, at the Wine Study Center, which, later became the Wine Study Center. So they actually set up a room in that building specifically for live, which was Al's doing. And but I live in Portland, and so slowly time went by. I started working more from home, and now it's completely remote. So, but Al moved away to California to retire, and we still talk. And I think that he's pretty happy with the way things have gone since he handed over the reins to me. They had someone working part-time, Teresa Solar, her name was, and I had never actually met her in person, but she trained me, over the phone, and we didn't have Zoom back then, so it was mostly over the phone and email. And I basically kind of like understood the way she was running things, and her and her partner were running things sort of half-time, and I came in and basically kept the things that she was doing that worked, and then I still do a few things that I still run things a little bit like she had run them back then in 2005-06, and they still work now. So from an administrative kind of thing. So the DNA of the program was there. It just needed, I think, someone to come in and like kind of polish it up and clear away the weeds, so to speak. And I think that's probably what I did in the beginning, and then I kind of moved into more of like a director position where I was actually like coming up with projects and building the program out to what I think it should have been eventually. So going from just kind of like a third-party certification of viticultural practices to more of a broad sustainability organization that's looked at from around the world as kind of a model for how to do this work. So yeah, I think that's kind of the arc of it.
Let's dive into that a little bit more. You mentioned the DNA, as you said it, kind of a third-party certification. So tell us about, sort of from your perspective, from your understanding, the kind of foundations of Live, and when you took it over, what was the point of it, and who was already involved at that point?
The point of it was to give third-party credibility to claims of sustainability. I think the big challenge back then, and still is to some degree, is this idea of greenwashing, of making claims that you're environmental or that you're sustainable without any kind of proof or third-party kind of standard that you're meeting or working towards. I think that was kind of the reason why it succeeded, was because there were a lot of growers that were doing this already. They were farming to what is now considered sustainable live standards, but there was no standard then, so they built it. And we hire contracted inspectors that have no kind of financial vested interest in whether you pass the inspection or not. So that's kind of the arm's length third party. And so they come in and they review your work versus what you say. You do a self-reporting of how you're managing your vineyard, or in the case of the winery certification, how you're managing your winery, and you submit some paperwork that backs that up. And then the inspector comes in and they walk the site with you, and they make sure that you're doing what you say you're doing. And we've had the same inspectors for a long time, and so they know the program inside and out. And their DNA is in the program just as much as Al's or mine or Jason Tosh's or anything like that, because they see hundreds of vineyards every year. But beyond the third-party certification, I thought, well, that's great, and that could sustain the organization as a business, kind of indefinite, as long as certification is sort of valuable in the marketplace as it was. But I wanted to do something bigger, I think, than just the certification, in order to bolster the standing of the organization, because we're a small industry in a small, wine producing state. When you look at global wine production, we're very, very small. So you have to do something that's special, I think, in order to be looked at as the model for the world. And so I started looking at things like, when I was first hired, they asked me to build out the winery certification, which didn't exist then. So we built a winery certification to complement the vineyard certification that was pretty successful at that point. And then the Oregon Wine Board decided that they wanted to create a program called Oregon Certified Sustainable Wine, which would allow growers to blend live and organic and biodynamic fruit into a bottling and have a label for it. Because with our program, you have to have nearly all of your grapes have to be certified. 97% have to be certified in order to use our logo on the bottle. And so there were people using our grapes and organic grapes, and they're saying, well, organic is sustainable too. And you can make an argument one way or the other depending on who you talk to, whether it is. But if it's practiced properly and with good intention, then it is sustainable. So you should be able to blend these crops together and have a label for it. And so the Oregon Wine Board created one, and that required that we have a winery certification, a processing certification, because organic has one, they have a processing one, Demeter has a processing one with biodynamic, and so they wanted us to create a processing certification. It could have been a bare bones thing, but we decided to go full bore and do basically a matching certification to the vineyard program, and so that's basically where that grew out of, and then. We just started to expand a little bit into, we were already in Washington a little bit in Walla Walla when I was hired, and we decided to expand into central Washington, into Idaho eventually in 2012. So we defined the Pacific Northwest as Oregon, Washington, and Idaho for the wine industry. So we don't certify in California, we don't certify outside of the Pacific Northwest, but we do work with other certifying bodies in New York. I helped to build a New York certification program a couple years ago. Long Island, the Finger Lakes, were part of this kind of consortium of sustainability organizations that the California Sustainable Wine Growing Alliance manages, which includes, California, Oregon, Washington, and New York. And so we're a big part of that. I've been to England to consult on their sustainability industry. They asked me to speak in Brussels at the EU Sustainability conference in 2012. That was kind of a highlight of my life, I think, was to actually kind of present this work to the EU, and during their sustainability week that they were having. So that was, that's all those things, put together sort of raised our profile, I think, about our standing in the world of sustainable wines, in general, sustainability as well. So
you talked a little bit about, obviously, steps you've taken. So obviously the idea of sustainability and the term sustainability has changed quite a bit since you took over, just in sort of among the general population. So how have you changed Live, or how has Live changed, and how are the standards now sort of compared to where they were?
I think that probably what Live has done, and I can't take credit for, by the way, all of this. This is a lot of volunteers. This is a lot of very smart people that are running our technical committees. Like currently, Lee Bartholomew is running our vineyard technical committee. Before her, we had Chad Vargas. We had Jason Tosh ran it for a number of years, and he probably, out of anybody, he probably has the most to say about. Had the most to say about our program's development, and had the most impact, I should say, about the standards and all of the things that we branched out into and stuff like that. I think that was mainly Jason, and everybody else has kind of built on that. But sustainability, I think that it was very narrowly focused when I came in, at least for Live. It was very narrowly focused to viticulture and to good viticultural practices. And I sort of said, okay, that's great. University Extension has a lot of these standards, or a lot of these recommendations, best practices already. So why don't we kind of, we're going to keep that obviously in our program, but let's also focus on the broader ecosystem, biodiversity, worker health and safety. Let's focus on social sustainability. Let's focus on oak trees, let's focus on pollinators. So these things weren't really talked about explicitly in our standard. They were sort of like a byproduct of doing this work in the beginning. But rather than being a byproduct, I wanted to educate the industry on these things explicitly and focus on, maybe one thing a year or something like that. Maybe this year we'll focus on oaks. A couple years ago we focused on pollinators. And so once you get people talking about this stuff, they learn about it and it gets exciting, and then maybe the public kind of, it's in the zeitgeist a little bit, and the public talks about pollinators more than they were a few years ago, and so they're looking for that kind of focus on businesses to save the bees, essentially. And I think that my job is to make people aware of this stuff before it catches up with them, and they have to go back and say, oh, I really need to do this thing because now the public's talking about it. And obviously people should be doing this anyway for the good of the planet and its intrinsic good, but a lot of people do this stuff because they're being asked to by their customers, and or they're seeing it in the marketplace that it has value and they want to do it. So I think my job is to kind of keep my finger on the pulse of like kind of the next thing, and I think I do that fairly well. So I think that's sort of like focusing on those individual issues over time, accumulate. And then that sort of builds the definition of sustainability, and you start to see where all of these things connect, and they all sort of intersect. And saving the pollinators and saving the oak habitat sort of go hand in hand. And by the way, birds live in trees, and by the way, bees feed on the nectar that are in the trees, and butterflies feed on a certain flower that only comes and lives underneath an oak tree. So these things, they start to see the connections. And I think when you give people the connections, they start to really understand the work and all of those best practices and all of those kind of like the little things that are in our standard that kind of are like, why are you even talking about shoot thinning or cover crop in the row? Like what are these like these things that you're talking about? Why aren't you talking about bigger things? And it's because they're all the building blocks of the bigger things. And so I think that sustainability now, people will say, oh, sustainability is just kind of like best practices conventional farming. It's like, well, maybe now they are, but before 10 years ago, 20 years ago, conventional farming was much worse than it is now. Now conventional farming and sustainable farming are sort of kind of closer together because conventional came over to sustainable. It's not that sustainable went the other way. I think that we did our job and that we've kind of eliminated conventional farming as it was seen in the 80s and 70s and after World War II and all of that. So we got rid of all of those really heavy inputs and kind of seeing the ground as sort of an inert medium to grow your crop. And now it's a living thing and people are seeing it as what it is. And so I think we've done our job in that sense. I think where I'd like to see it go is, okay, now that we're there, what's the next step? And the next step is to regenerate, right? So we've got regenerative agriculture coming into the mainstream now, and I think people need to be thinking about not just keeping things at status quo, not keeping things at net, not good, not bad, but kind of net neutral, and going towards repairing all of the damage that's been done. And obviously we can't do that alone in the wine industry in Oregon. It's a global thing. It's got to be done by every industry, agriculture, aerospace, it's got to be done by all of these kind of heavy industries. We're a very small part of the puzzle, but it's our part, right? I like to say we're a small drop in the ocean, but it's our drop. It's kind of the thing I say at meetings. And I think it resonates because people get so overwhelmed because the world is on fire and, what do we do? You can't solve the problem just by managing your vineyard in a regenerative way, but I like to think of things, like this comes back to kind of like my philosophy background, Kant's categorical imperative, which is to act in a way that your actions would become a universal law. And he was talking about morality, but I think that I have sort of an environmental equivalent to that, which is, act in a way that your environmental actions would become a universal law. So like if you were to throw a soda can out your window of the car, that means it's okay for everybody to do that. If you were to plant a tree, that means it's good for everybody to do that. So what are the things that would be okay for everybody to do? Not even okay, but good for everybody to do, and do those things. So that's sort of where I stand now and how I view environmentalism, is to do those things yourself, knowing that you're doing your part and that it might inspire others to do the same thing.
You mentioned both sort of the number of volunteers and the board of directors obviously working with you. Tell me about having that amount of people in on this kind of project and answering to different people, how do you form consensus? How do you decide what live standards are going to be and kind of where your practice is going to go?
Sure. So, I mean, the standards, this is a little bit of kind of like technical housekeeping, but like the standards come from Europe. So we have a third-party accreditation called the IOBC, which stands for the International Organization for Biological Control. And I know that you've spoken to a few people about this organization, and they oversee, they basically do applied research in sustainability, and they're a global organization. We deal with their European chapter. And that's the organization that helped us build Live in the first place. They gave us a framework, basically, of sustainable standards to build on. And then we take those standards and we craft them through committees. So we have a number of, we call them technical committees, that take the standards and work them to regional appropriateness. And then when we're done with that, we send them back to Europe for approval. So if we take their standard and we change it too much, they might say, well, wait a minute, why are you doing that? What's so special about Oregon or Washington that you have to do this, that you have to allow this particular pesticide or something like that? And then we'll give them the research and we'll work it out. And so there's a consensus building between Europe and our program, between the IOBC and our program, but consensus within our program is, we're a pretty harmonious group for the most part. I think the growers all know each other, and that's kind of one of the benefits of having a small industry. I think everybody sort of knows what everyone is going to say at these meetings, and so you kind of come in with these ideas, and my tactic, and maybe I shouldn't even say this, but my tactic is to come in with the answer already, and then get everyone to sort of understand my thinking behind the answer, and try to arrive at it, if it is the right answer. But sometimes it's not the right answer. Sometimes I come in with an idea and they're like, wait a minute, that's not how things work. And so then you get people talking, but you have to seed the conversation, or else people kind of just sit there like, why am I at this meeting? Usually it's about a new product that's come out or something like that. This product is a biological, maybe this could replace one of the other older chemicals that is a synthetic or something like that. And then we have to go through the paces of like, what does this chemical do? What are its toxicities, if any? Worker health and safety issues, if any? Pollinator issues, if any? So we go through kind of a rigorous process of deciding whether a standard is appropriate, whether that's a chemical or a different kind of practice or something like that. Right now, for example, we have someone at Linfield talking about social sustainability. In our social sustainability part of our standard, it's a little bit lacking. So we had Linfield do basically a literature review of all the different standards that are out there for this kind of thing, and they came back to us with a long list of recommendations of what we could put into our standard. And so now the next step is for a committee to look at that and make comments. And maybe this belongs in the standard, maybe this belongs as a field day or a newsletter or something like that, but maybe it doesn't belong in the standard necessarily. So those kind of decisions get made at committee level, and then when the committee agrees, which is more or less every time they come to an agreement, they hammer something out, that will pass it on to the board of directors for a vote, and then the board will vote, and then that will get recommended to the IOBC, and then they'll approve it. And so there's a process of changing or amending or removing standards or anything like that. So the consensus thing, sometimes, there are definitely thorny issues that have come up regularly. There are thorny issues mainly with chemicals. So whether something is appropriate for a sustainability program, whether something's appropriate for our sustainability program, or for Oregon or for Washington, conditions are different, climate conditions are different. Farming is different in Eastern Washington than it is in the Willamette Valley. So I think that's where consensus can be difficult, and that's where things can kind of drag out sometimes. And nobody really wants to upset anybody because we're all friends and colleagues, and so I think that there tends to be a little bit of caution where maybe a decision might need to be made that might upset somebody. So or we might lose members because we decide to take a stand on something. And that's a consideration, because if we don't have enough members, the program can't support itself. And if the program can't support itself, then we can't push out all of the other good work that we're doing. If we're focusing on this one little thing that maybe is an issue that someone isn't happy with, and we take a stand on it, let's say we lose, 50% of our members because we took a stand on whatever it is, bottle weight or glyphosate or something like that. If we take a stand on that, we lose half our members, we lose the program, and then what? So that consideration is there. It's not the final consideration by any means. It's not an overriding consideration, but it's definitely something we think about. But that's more of a business consideration and a organizational thing than a scientific or kind of sustainability-minded thing. Although I guess if you don't have a business, you're not sustainable, right? So.
You brought up earlier kind of a customer service background, and now feeling like there's a bit of a customer service. So tell me about both the kind of the dealing with the members you have, and also attracting new members. How does it work, and how do you sort of approach it from that kind of customer experience or customer service perspective?
Sure. I mean, I think that probably the biggest plus that customer service gives is that answer to technical questions about farming or winemaking we can give to the technical committees to answer. So I funnel that to the right person, depending on the question that comes in. But a lot of questions are about, when is my inspection? Where's my certificate? How do I access this or that on the website? And so there's a lot of kind of this stuff isn't easy. It's a very niche thing that we're asking people to do, and so you have to kind of walk them through it. And one year I remember I sat with somebody in a coffee shop for like 3 hours just teaching them how to do the website, and that person's been a member ever since. That was like 10 years ago. So it's like you give someone help and you teach them how to do it, and you teach them how the mechanics of the program work, and then the rest is easy for them because they're already doing it really on the farm, and so they're just filing the paperwork that they probably would be keeping anyway. And so the customer service aspect of it is more about kind of the minutia and the mechanics of the program, but that's how I kind of work with current members. Right now, we just hired actually a communications coordinator a couple months ago, and right today actually she's calling around to all of our members in the Willamette Valley and inviting them to this field day that we're having on August 1st. And I told her, well, don't just invite them to the field day. Ask them if they're having any issues or if they have any questions. And there have been a couple questions like, when's my inspection? Because maybe the inspector hasn't gotten in touch with them yet or something like that. So unless we get in touch with them, typically they won't contact me until it's too late, or so we have to be proactive about talking to people. And as far as getting new members, a lot of it's word of mouth. A lot of it is the vineyard management companies signing up their new clients to Live, Results Partners, Sterling Wine Grapes, Atlas. They all they tell them about this program because a lot of their new clients might be new to farming or new to the wine industry, and they don't know what this certification is all about and why they should spend the money on it or something like that. And I wouldn't say they sell them on it, but they educate them about it. And I think that that's where many of our new members come from, is from the management companies actually, when they have new clients. And of course we have a presence at the Oregon Wine Symposium, and sometimes we advertise in the Oregon Wine Press and industry things. It doesn't necessarily come from public demand usually. Sometimes it comes from distributor, or certain markets will ask for a certification. There are certain markets that require certification to sell certain types of bottlings, and if that's the case, then sometimes we'll get someone frantic saying, oh, can I get certified this year, and how do I do that? And so you have to kind of calm them down a little bit and give them a little bit of reassurance that it's not too hard, we can do it. And so a lot of it's kind of just hand-holding is the wrong word, because these are very capable people, but it's very, like I said, it's very niche, it's very specific. And so speaking to them in a respectful way and understanding what their question is and what their needs are and what their fears are, there's a lot of psychology going into this too. So I think that, like I said earlier, my first job talking to these band directors really helped me because those were some angry people. And so I really understand, I think, what it's like to need something and be afraid that you might not be able to get it, you know? So I try to help people to achieve whatever it is they want within reason, of course. So I think that actually sets us apart a little bit from the other certifiers. So, you know, someone might say, well, why would I go through it live instead of through the organic program? Well, the organic program is a federal program that applies to all crops, and, you know, as such, they might not have the best, you know, kind of, or most responsive, I guess, kind of customer service to their standard. The certifiers are good, the local certifiers like Oregon Tilth and Oregon Department of Agriculture, those are the certifiers for the organic standard, but they're beholden to this behemoth in the federal government, and so they only have so much freedom to do things for people that could help them out along the way. So I think that's kind of where we have an advantage, is that we're of the industry in that all of our volunteers are industry people. I'm not a grower, I'm not a winemaker, so I'm kind of like the arm's length, and the inspectors are the arm's length, and the IOBC is the arm's length. And so we don't have growers writing their own standards to which they're certifying. We have third parties that are a check to that. But the industry knowledge is really important for making sure that the standard means something and that it's achievable within a framework of sustainability and a framework of actually improving the conditions in the region.
You mentioned being the non-grower in the group, the non-winemaker in the group. How, especially in the beginning, how did you go about sort of making your authority mean something? How did you go about kind of fitting in and showing people that you knew what you were talking about and were the right leader for the space?
Well, I took a VIT class with Al, actually, at McDonald at Chemeketa, and that helped a lot. He's a great teacher. And I've read pretty much everything I could get my hands on and went to every meeting that I could go to. And eventually, you know, I actually had a meeting with someone the other day that said, how do you know all this stuff about these chemicals? Like, are you a chemist? And it's like, no, I've been doing this for almost 20 years. And after a while, the same names stick with you. And it's like, oh, it's this one again, you know? And so you start to see like what the problems are with each of them. And then you sort of talk about how to move away from doing it. And then like kind of the integrated pest management and the integrated production in the winery, these things are common among all of the different certification programs around the world. So what to do for a certain pest in Oregon is going to probably be the same thing that you're going to do for that same pest in California or Washington. It might be a slightly different chemical because of the conditions in the soil or the climate. But the cultural methods, which is what we call them, like pulling the leaves for powdery mildew, so you have airflow, that's the same everywhere. So I think that you start to see this stuff over and over and over again, and eventually you can't help but to become an expert on it if you stick around long enough. So I think it's probably just a matter of me doing this for so long that eventually, oh, he's the one that knows about that, you know. So.
Have you seen people looking for live when they're looking for a bottle of wine? Have you seen live become kind of a standard for consumers?
Me personally, because I tend to talk about it more than other people when I go shopping for, you know, I'll say to like the wine steward at New Seasons, oh, do you have any live wines? And they'll know what that means because they're the one buying the product, and that particular chain of grocery stores really is interested in sustainability. So they'll show me, and I'll just turn around the bottles and see the label. And that's because I shop there for the most part. But if you go into a bigger kind of global brand like Safeway or something like that, you might not see the label as much, and they might not know what you're talking about because they're not a niche kind of sustainability grocery store. That's not what they're not trying to sell that kind of a product. They're not taking that angle. And so it really depends on who you talk to, I guess, is the answer to that question. I think that there have been studies that have been done through Full Glass Research, and Washington State University did a study that said that live certification brings about a $3 premium to wines over non-certified wines, $3 a bottle. And Full Glass Research has said that, all other things equal, so price, look, aesthetics, the certification will be the tiebreaker, whether it's live or organic or whatever. So I think that the public is probably, the public is awake now. They want the world to be better. And I think that anything you can do, whether it's B Corp or live or organic, or any kind of standard that ostensibly will help fix things, if everybody was doing them, is going to be the one that people choose that are interested in those issues and that are somewhat, have somewhat of an awareness of environmentalism or social sustainability or DEI or anything like that. You're gonna start seeing people choosing their products by how they're made and how the company that makes them acts in the global kind of business community. And I think the role that certifications play is that, we actually set a pretty rigorous standard for them. Even the least rigorous certification does have merit, and it's better than nothing. Now, people can probably, they'll say, well, I'm already doing this, and I'm actually going way beyond what Live is asking for, and that's great. And I'm the first person to say, if you don't see value in our particular certification, don't do it, because whatever you're doing is working for you. But all of our standards are published. They're all open source. We allow people to download them off our website and farm to them if they want to. But to get that label on the bottle, you have to prove to the government, actually, when you go for your labeling approval, that you have the certificate. So there's a check there as well. So if you're saying you're live certified, you have to have the certificate. But yeah, if you go beyond live, if you're doing things that are way beyond what we're asking for, then talk about it. You might not have a certification that actually meets your rigor, so make one. If it means that much to you to have a certification on your bottle, then create one.
You mentioned earlier kind of the presentation in Brussels being kind of a career highlight for you. Tell me about how that came to be, how you came to be invited to that, and what was sort of the message you wanted to impart to the EU?
Well, the IOBC was involved with it. So the IOBC is an outgrowth of actually the UN from the 50s. I forget what the original name of it was, but they were founded as a result of all of the kind of intensive agriculture that came out of World War II and all the chemicals and everything like that. So they've been around for a long time, and they're very respected in Europe especially. And they were invited to this, and they said, you have this program in the States that you're working with. Why don't you bring them out to talk about certification? Because the IOBC doesn't actually do certification. They put out standards. They do research and they put out standards, and then we act as sort of a field test case for them. And so they invited me, and I talked about certification. And the funny thing was they were running behind, so I actually didn't get as much time as I wanted. So I had to give all of my presentation in an abbreviated speech, but it was well received, and it's so long ago now that I barely remember it. But just the feeling that we had arrived, I think, on a global stage and at a legislative level, even if it wasn't the States, it was someone from another country saying, or from another group of countries saying, what you're doing is interesting enough that we should consider it here. Maybe it's valuable for our member states to implement some kind of a certification scheme for the wine industry. And I think for instance, in Switzerland, they had subsidies for people that would do this stuff. We're not there yet, so we don't have subsidies for people to plant pollinator-friendly plants or anything like that. So hopefully that's maybe coming up because people respond to subsidies. Obviously, why wouldn't you? This stuff isn't cheap. Planting certain things isn't cheap, and changing your habits isn't cheap. And a lot of this stuff gets externalized down the line to pollution and things like that if you don't do them. So that's where you save the money, is someone else has to pay for it eventually. So yeah, I think that the Brussels event was important for me to also meet people that were not in my usual circle and that like would inspire me to do maybe other things. I had one mentor who was with the IOBC actually, Frank Winans, his name was, and he wrote a lot of the standards, and I sort of looked up to him as a person who was doing the things that I was maybe at the time not brave enough to do or say, for fear of, I don't know, people saying like, oh, you're too extreme, or we'll find somebody else to do this work that maybe isn't so pushing us so hard, But he would say things like, oh, you're howling with the wolves, Chris. If I were to try to kind of like justify, some kind of bad, not bad behavior, but justify some kind of like behavior that was status quo, let's say. You're howling with the wolves. And I always remember that. He passed away from COVID. So that person had a big impact on my life. He did, and Jason Tosh did, and Al did as well. So all of this stuff all of this is to say that I think that like meeting as many people that are doing this work is really, really important, because you're going to see things that you hadn't thought of. You're going to hear arguments you hadn't thought of. You're going to maybe reconsider ideas that you thought were good ideas, and have some really good, some really good Belgian beer afterwards. There's something to be said for camaraderie too.
So give us an idea of sort of what a typical day looks like for you, or a typical week, typical month looks like for you as an executive director of Live. Obviously, you mentioned working remotely now. So what is it you're focusing on, and what do you kind of focus your time on?
Well, for the last few months, it's been training up our new employee, and she comes from a non-wine background and actually a non-sustainability background. We hired her for her communications skills and her ideas and her general demeanor, and so training her on all of this stuff, it's basically retraining myself, because I haven't had to do that in 5 years or something like that. So I'm retraining myself essentially on all of this work. A lot of things change so fast in the industry that it's like connections and who owns what and what the goals of the industry are change, and the climate keeps changing. So it's like what's coming down the pike next. So a typical week for me is right now, like I said, training her. So a lot of Zoom calls, a lot of answering emails, and kind of walking her through what her job should be and what is appropriate for the tone of Live. If she's doing a lot of kind of social media and newsletters, and it's like, well, we don't want to be too goofy and we don't want to be too serious. We're sort of like, we need to be approachable and friendly, but also know what we're talking about. So kind of finding that space is really tricky, but she's doing a great job. So her name is Isabel Toby. So for the record here, if you want to interview her in 5 or 6 years, yeah, that'll be good. So other than that, a lot of answering emails, a lot of times I'll have to coordinate with technical committees to work on issues like if someone has a pest issue that none of our standards will address, someone might submit what's called a variance, and they'll say, oh, we want to be able to do this, but your standard doesn't allow it. So can you look at this and tell us if it's got merit, if it would work, if it's sustainable, if we could possibly do it and still be in your program. And so that takes up some time, managing the volunteers, speaking with, I just had a meeting with Catherine Cole about her podcast, and she's going to have us on her podcast. And so talking to her about what that looks like, having a meeting with the media and having a meeting with a lot of meetings and so on. But they're not so much meetings as they are just kind of like chit chats with who I consider friends at this point. So it's not so corporate. And a lot of reading. I try to keep up on all of this stuff because it's constantly changing, and by the time you learn something, it's out of date, and you have to keep up with that. Last year I worked on a new website, which took up a lot of my time. So that's, building customer information systems, that comes back to the customer service again, making sure people know like how to do certain things and that it's easy for them. All that stuff, it's very intentional and it takes a lot of time. And when you do it right, it looks like it didn't take any time. Mm-hmm. Putting on the annual meeting, for instance, we start that in August, September, and then we put it on in March of the following year. We had Jancis Robinson come out to our last annual meeting. That conversation started in like October of the previous year. And even just finding her email address took a week. So having to, talk to as many people as possible that know her or have dealt with her, and it's a lot of kind of Sherlock Holmes kind of stuff. Actually, that is a lot of my job, is kind of like this like detective work for the members for the annual meeting. Trying to figure out who the next speaker is for the annual meeting that people might be interested in. And the annual meeting is a lot of logistics, it's a lot of event planning. And so that meeting, it's usually at the end of March, that usually brings to a head all of the work that everybody's been doing since like right around harvest. So like right after harvest is when my harvest starts. So I'm very busy in December, very busy in January. Everybody has off in January and is able to go to meetings. And so that's when all the meetings happen. And so I'm at a meeting, technical committee meeting, regularly in January, and then I have to take their work, and it's all this stuff, and, in a Google file, and then I take it and I put it into a document that has to work for the membership to understand. And it seems easy when you kind of talk about it, but when you sit down and do it, it's not easy, because it takes a lot of design work and like human psychology, like I was mentioning, and where are people going to click on the website, user design and things like that. User experience. So I think a lot of my job is trying to understand how to best serve the work that we're doing to the members, and how to best serve the work that they're doing, because really they're doing all the work. I'm presenting them with the recommendations and the standards, but they're the ones that are out there doing the actual work. And so I have to give justice to that and serve that in a way that honors their work. That's important to me, and it's all very carefully considered. Let's put it that way. So there's a lot of careful consideration during my week. Maybe sometimes overthinking things, which that's a whole nother story. So
a byproduct.
Yeah.
I'm curious about 2020 specifically, given all the complications of that year. Obviously, systems are always pretty easy to do when everything's running fine and easy, and then you have a year like 2020 happen. So I'm curious about that year specifically, if there was anything unique or that you had to handle in that year, any kind of, from your perspective, that harvest, what was unique about it?
That's a great question. I mean, from my perspective, way before harvest. So when it first started, when COVID first kind of got announced as a thing, it was I think January or February, and our annual meeting was coming up in March, and I said to the board, should we postpone the annual meeting or cancel it? And I remember someone on the board said, "Oh, it's just this will be done over in 6 weeks," And I was like, I don't know about that. And so obviously, in hindsight, but back then we didn't know what was happening. And so I talked to our lawyer and asked them because we're a nonprofit corporation, we have to have an annual meeting. I asked them, what do we do, if we can't have it? And they said, well, you can cancel it or have it, online or something like that if you really needed to, as long as you have a vote for the board and everything like that. So as long as you fulfill the legal obligations, it's okay if you cancel the meeting. So we canceled it. And that was the first time ever that we've canceled an annual meeting. And I bring it up because that is our big kind of marquee event that I think is probably the most important part of the year from an organizational perspective and kind of collegial perspective, people getting together. And so for the next couple of years, we had it via Zoom. And I tend to, with stuff like that, I tend to be overly cautious or what I consider probably appropriately cautious. Let's say that. And so I didn't want to send the inspectors out into the field, and people were upset. Why is my inspector calling me over Zoom? I have to be in the field. Why can't they be in the field? And so, well, there's a respect for their health. Well, one of our inspectors is a cancer survivor, so he's got immunocompromised issues. And then they're visiting multiple people in a day, and a lot of our members are a little bit older. And so it's like you have to have some kind of consideration for that. And so I made the decision to not send anyone out in the field for a couple of years. And so all of the inspections were done via Zoom and via FaceTime and kind of sending in videos and things like that instead of being there in person. And people didn't really like that, but they understood, of course, in the long run. And I think they came to appreciate the caution. And we're really getting fully back in the field this year. This was kind of the first year that we're really sending people back to every vineyard to do an on-site inspection. So there really is a value to it. And I think I caught a lot of flack for being cautious on that, but I stand by it. And as far as the harvest goes, that was the wildfire year, and I think people were really freaking out about that, and rightfully so. And I don't know, to be perfectly honest, I don't know if it actually bore out any kind of problems in the wine. That's for somebody else to answer. So, it's like you're dealing with kind of these massive catastrophic events all happening at the same time, and still trying to do this very niche thing that maybe isn't, the most important thing in the world for the people that you're serving. And we went from 340 something vineyards down to, I think our lowest point was like 319. So we lost quite a bit of membership that year because people were like, we're not even going to bottle our wine this year. So like, why would we go through with this, And then, they started to trickle back in the following couple of years, and we're kind of, in this weird spot now where people don't know what to do, I think. A lot of people are going organic now, and why should I do both kind of thing? So that's the valid question. But COVID kind of wreaked a little bit of havoc on everybody, obviously, a lot of bit of havoc. And luckily I have a good team, and they all know how to use Zoom. And so and I had already been working remotely up till that point anyway, so it wasn't such a big deal for me. But the isolation, I think, was a problem for people. And I don't know, there's this feeling, I think, of community sort of that got fractured during that. Not that there was like this big sort of feeling of community before then in the modern world, but I think that like the community feeling that we had before in live sort of to get a little brittle. We're rebuilding it now and everything with more in-person events and stuff like that. But I think that's the only way we're going to get out of the situation we're in the world, is with this kind of like reconnection with each other and sort of trying to get rid of this alienation from our work. And I don't know, I think that has a lot to do with the harm that's being caused in the world today, is that everyone's sort of kind of like in their own silos and doing their own things, and nobody thinks that they're going to be able to solve anything by themselves, so they just don't do anything, So I think that the community aspect of live is actually probably, I would say, in the top three answers that I get whenever I ask a group of people, like, why are you in the program? It's the connections with their colleagues and coming to the meetings and stuff like that. It's usually, in the top three answers that I get.
Especially from a sort of sustainability, agricultural perspective, where is it now compared to where it was when you started?
I'd say it's more of an industry now. When I started, I didn't start that long ago. It was 17 years ago I started, which was, a good amount of time. But in 2007, it was you could tell that it was turning into a full-fledged industry. I think that it started off as sort of a group of kind of visionaries, maybe even misfits, if you want to call them that, and they proved that something beautiful could be done, and then it turned into more, I think, of an artisan craft kind of industry, and then that brings with it, I think, a cachet and like a coolness and sort of a, ooh, how do I get in on that? I mean, it's the story of a lot of things, right? So, and then the money starts coming in, and it's, turns it into like a full-fledged industry where things are kind of churning every year. And I see a lot more vineyards that are being managed by management companies rather than by the owner of the vineyard. There's still, of course, the artisan aspect of it, and I think that's probably the bulk of the industry. But I think that now we're a globally recognized wine industry here, so kind of have to feed that with product, and you see the industry growing as a result of that. The number of acres planted, and then the price of grapes, and the price of wine, and everything like that. So. Yeah, I mean, when I first came here, I moved to Oregon in January of 2007, and I kind of didn't know the first thing about the industry here, and I was kind of just like starry-eyed about it, and just like everybody else, I think, that comes to a place like this for the first time, and it's so different than New Jersey, right? So, I guess it's become more moving faster and more. There's a higher risk, I think, to decision making, because you're risking all that's been built. I'm not trying to be diplomatic here, but I think that there is a risk tolerance that prevents people from a low risk tolerance that prevents people from making big decisions on matters that might impact their bottom line or impact the reputation or their whole crop for all that's worth. So I think that, yeah, maybe people were willing to take more risks back then and try things, even if they didn't fail. And I think that comes back to the community aspect, where you're more willing to take risks when you know that people have your back. If you're going to fail at something, at least people will have your back and bring you back up, if you fall. So I think when industries become too mechanical or detached kind of from the product, and it's you might as well be growing widgets, so like when that starts to happen, then people don't want to take the risk because they're afraid they'll just be chewed up in the machine and left behind. And so I like to see collaboration. I like to see people say like, oh, let's think of a different way to do this thing that might not be commercialized right now. Maybe we can figure out a different way to do this to make it more sustainable that no one's thought of before. I would like to see more imagination. I'd like to see more creativity and, like I said earlier, poetry. So like just kind of like this like feeling of, look at this place. Look at what we're growing. Taste what we're growing. Smell what we're growing. Like we're not, pumping out Mitsubishis. They're beautiful natural products that we're growing, and that can make a transcendent thing. So I wouldn't say I have a lament for the way things have gone, but I do kind of look at it as like, all right, guys, like, we've built all this great capital and this great reputation. Let's like use it for the good of everybody and the good of the planet and its people and everything. And I think people are doing that for the most part. But it's like, it's very, what's the word? Tantalizing to kind of go after the money. So I hope that anyone listening to this doesn't think I'm talking about them. But yeah, I think that if you make a good product or have a good service, the money will come and you'll be served. So.
And what comes next for the industry? Where do you see it going?
Well, one of my heroes is Mimi Castile.
Everyone's hero.
Yeah, everyone's hero. I just saw her speak in Napa for a convention on climate change, and her focus now is on water and how to hold on to it for agricultural use, but just for human use, and for obviously for the environment and for all of we're not the only things here, right? So we have to stop thinking about ourselves as being kind of like what comes first for us kind of thing. So I think she has that mindset, and I love listening to her talk, and I think that I would love to see more people kind of follow that path. I mean, Mimi is kind of one end of the spectrum where I think that people have to do what's right for them. And I don't think that what she's espousing is like right for everybody, obviously, or what I'm espousing. And so I think people have to do what's right for them, but I want everyone to hear it. And I want everyone to kind of understand where we're coming from and why we're saying the things that we're saying, and kind of, asking people to do the things that we're asking. And so if I can help it, I think the industry will take that outward growth that it's been seeing for so many years and maybe turn it inward and grow the quality of the product and get closer to it and less mechanical with it, and not get taken in by these kind of like AI and precision agriculture and all of this stuff that can be used as an aid, but like not to rely on it as sort of the solution, the silver bullet. You see a lot of people say, oh, now this thing is coming out, this whatever it is, an electric tractor or a different kind of package or something like that. It's going to solve all our problems. And it reminds me a lot of when I was a teenager and I played guitar, and I used to write songs, and I used to think, oh, only if I had that one pedal, I'd be a great musician. If I had that pedal, I could write this song, for my guitar. It reminds me a lot of that. Like, it's like you have to like push all that stuff away and just like get back to, I think, basics, and use those things to get closer to what you're trying to do, and not try to just use it to solve like the problem of I have too much work to do and it's too expensive. Let's like find this next thing, this drone or something like that to solve our problem. So yeah, I think that those things can be an aid, but they can also alienate you from the things you're trying to do. But I think that the industry might probably start relying on that kind of stuff more often because of labor shortages, because some of it is more sustainable from kind of an energy consumption point of view. An electric tractor is better than a diesel tractor from a climate perspective. So, but you have to understand that it's not going to solve everything, and it's not going to eliminate the problem of monoculture. And if anything, it could make it worse, because there's something called the Jevons paradox, where if you come up with a product or an invention that maybe saves some energy or saves makes some efficiency, that efficiency tends to get used up by more of the product. So like the famous example is like replacing halogen light bulbs with LEDs in street lamps, right? You replace this, it's great, we have much lower energy uses from the street lamps. Well, they just put more street lamps in, because with all that saved energy, they're able to put more lights in. And so you have to be careful with that. And I think that happens with every industry, and it's a danger that happens with farming too. And winemaking is that you find this thing that's like this kind of like really great new technology, and then it allows you to like get bigger without any kind of consideration for what that bigness will do to the world. Because you're on your own, 30-acre farm. You're not farming 1 million acres. You're not an entire ecosystem. You're a micro ecosystem. You don't, I think, see kind of the impacts beyond your own farm. So if you make your life easier, then it's a good thing, right? But it might externalize down the line. So I hope the industry just is cautious with that kind of stuff, because I think they're shiny new objects all the time.
What about for your future in the industry? What comes next for you? What are you looking ahead to?
Does a magician ever really reveal his secrets? I don't know. The industry is, and this job is cyclical, so it's, every season has its has its thing, and trying to keep things fresh and inspire people, and maybe like try to not wear myself out in people's minds, like wear their patience out with me. So what's next for me? I would really like to maybe take my foot off the pedal a little bit. I've been going hard for so long, and I think that it's, I'm a little burned out on it, to be frank. But I still have the energy and the interest and the passion in it. It's just I have to try to get more people involved and have them sort of take on a little bit of the burden. I mean, don't get me wrong, like in our program, we have so many people doing so much work at a volunteer level. So I am blown away by how many people put their energy and effort into it. But the mental energy, I guess, of doing this work is, some people just will say, just take a vacation. So, but if I take a vacation, there's no one to do the work. So it's like, that's catch-22, right? So my future, I'm a creative type, and I want to do more creative things. I actually have said this, that the first part of my life, I'm 47, the first 47 years of my life, I've been using my brain, and now I want to use my hands. My grandfather was a plumber. I come from sort of working class background, and I think my parents sort of shielded me from that, because I think as the generations go, if you have see someone struggle with their hands and you want your children to work with their minds and make a good living and stuff like that, I think that's great, and I really appreciate my parents doing that for me. But I see there's a thing that's calling me, and I don't know what it is. It's something to do with my hands, whether that's making art or playing music or whatever it is, making things with my hands rather than my mind. So I don't know if that has anything to do with the wine industry or with live, but that's the next half of my life. I'm kind of gonna try to maybe go towards that sort of a mode.
So you mentioned earlier in your interview the idea of wine being able to sort of support a sort of transcendent experience. So I'm curious, as we kind of wrap this interview up, tell me about, for you personally, tell me about a wine transcendent experience that you've had and something that sort of stuck with you.
99 Beaufrere at the Heathman Hotel with Sterling Fox. I remember we were at a table. I don't remember who else was there. There was like a full table, but I remember he ordered that, and he's like, "What do you taste this?" And I had it, and it was like I thought I'd been drugged, and I hadn't been drinking that much. I wasn't drunk or anything like that. It took me somewhere else that like I've never been to again. I was like, this is metaphysical. And I know I watched your interview with Al, and he said that wine is just a drink to have with pork chops, I think he said, right? And that's true, but first of all, I'm a vegetarian, so I don't eat pork chops. But that's ignoring that transcendence. And, every different kind of fermented beverage has its own buzz, and wine has a very special one. And yeah, I don't even know how to explain it. It was magic. It was just like something that had never happened before or since. And I've had other experiences with good wines. 1984, Amity Vineyards with Al McDonald at a dinner in McMinnville, that the sommelier said, I'm going to open this. It's one of the last bottles left of this vintage from this producer, and you have to drink it within 15 minutes or else it's gone. And so we had it, and it was amazing, and it was transcendent, but it was nothing compares to that Beaufrere that I had. That was probably the most magical moment of wine in my life. So, and Sterling is one of my good friends, so it's like you get to commune with these beautiful people over this beautiful thing. And Beaufrere is biodynamic, organic, so they're sustainable, yeah. Right. So so I think that all was good that night. I want to have more nights like that in my life.
Absolutely. Thank you. That's all the questions that I have for you. Anything I didn't ask that I should have? Anything that we didn't cover today that you'd like to cover?
No, I think that was everything. I didn't think I was going to be able to fill an hour. To be frank, I was like, what am I going to talk about?
So everybody says that. That's
Yeah.
the challenge I take. Well, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your stories with us and your philosophies with us as well. And thank you again to the folks at Ponzi for the use of their space. We always appreciate them making time for us here. We'll go ahead and let you off the hook.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.